The courtroom was smaller than Constance Aldridge had expected. She had spent 42 years living in large spaces, the kind that announced themselves before you entered them, that required you to be conscious of your footsteps on marble and your reflection in surfaces polished to the standard of display rather than comfort. She had grown accustomed without entirely choosing to the vocabulary of a life lived at a certain scale. Grand staircases, dining rooms that seated 14, a kitchen renovated twice in a decade because the appliances, though functional, had become aesthetically dated in ways that apparently could not be tolerated. This courtroom had linoleum floors and fluorescent lighting and wooden chairs that creaked when you shifted your weight, and it was the most honest room Constance Aldridge had sat in for as long as she could remember. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, her back straight, her face composed into the expression she had practiced in the bathroom mirror of the extended stay hotel on the north side of Columbus, where she had been living for 3 months. The expression of a woman who was calm, who had considered her situation from every available angle and arrived at something she could stand on. She was not certain it was convincing. She was certain it was necessary. Across the room at the other table, Garrison Aldridge sat with his attorney. The attorney was a man in his late 30s named Prescott, who wore a suit that cost more than most people's monthly mortgage payments and who had spent 3 months treating the dissolution of Constance's 42-year marriage as a moderately interesting professional exercise. He kept his phone face up on the table and glanced at it between whispered consultations with Garrison, the way young men did when they considered the present moment insufficiently important to warrant their full attention. Garrison had not looked at her once since they entered the room. Not once. She had been watching in the careful peripheral way she had developed over 4 decades of living with a man who did not like to feel observed. She was certain from the moment they took their seats on their respective sides of this small linoleum-floored room, Garrison Aldridge had directed his gaze everywhere except toward his wife. At the windows, at the wall behind the judge's bench, at his attorney's whispered counsel, at his phone which he had silenced but kept checking in the manner of a man awaiting news of genuine importance from somewhere else. He could not look at her. She had spent 3 months trying to understand what that meant. Whether it meant guilt, which would have required a self-awareness she was no longer certain he possessed. Whether it meant contempt, which was more consistent with the man she had come to know in the final decade of their marriage. Whether it meant something simpler and more devastating, that she had become, in his accounting, a problem to be resolved rather than a person to be faced. The proceedings had been going since April. It was now the second week of June, and outside the courthouse windows, the Ohio summer was asserting itself with the full insistence of a season that knows its time is limited. All heat and green, and the sound of lawnmowers on distant streets, the ordinary sounds of ordinary neighborhoods conducting their ordinary business, while inside this room the arithmetic of a life was being divided into columns. Prescott was speaking. He had been speaking with interruptions for the better part of 2 hours. His argument was precise and well-constructed, and delivered with the confidence of a man who had made this particular argument before and expected it to work again. The argument was this, that Garrison Aldridge, as the primary and in most years the sole financial contributor to the Aldridge household throughout 42 years of marriage, had built their assets through his own professional effort and acumen, and that Constance, having left her teaching position in 1987, when Owen was born in order to raise their son and manage the household, had made a choice that, while understandable and even admirable, did not constitute a financial contribution equivalent to the investment banking career that had produced those assets. The mansion on Whitfield Drive was worth approximately $3.2 million. Garrison wanted all of it. Constance listened to Prescott make this argument and felt beneath the composed expression she was maintaining for the room a specific and clarifying anger, not the hot and immediate anger of the moment, which was easy to dismiss and easier to dismantle under cross-examination. A colder anger, the anger of a woman reviewing 42 years of evidence and arriving at a verdict about what those years had actually been, as seen from the perspective of the man sitting across the room who was declining to look at her. Beside her, Winifred Cobb leaned close. "We can fight this. Equal distribution is a reasonable claim. You gave up your career. You raised Owen. You managed that household for 4 decades. We can make this argument." Constance looked at her. Winifred was in her mid-50s, serious with the steadiness of someone who had spent a professional life helping people navigate the worst days they would likely encounter. She was good at her work. Constance trusted her. How long? Constance asked. 18 months maybe. Could go longer depending on appeals. And the cost? Legal fees your side alone 80,000 minimum. More if it extends. Constance was quiet for a moment. Through the courtroom window she could see the parking lot, and in the parking lot during the recess that had just concluded, she had watched Garrison standing beside his car making a phone call. She had watched his posture change when the call connected, the slight loosening of the shoulders, the tilt of the head, the quality of attention a person gives to someone they are genuinely glad to hear from. She had watched this for approximately 30 seconds and then looked away because she had seen enough. Claudette, that was the name on the phone screen she had glimpsed once months ago when Garrison had left his phone on the kitchen counter and a message arrived. A single message on the locked screen. 4 words and a punctuation mark that confirmed what Constance had been sensing in the architecture of their marriage for longer than she had allowed herself to consciously acknowledge. She had said nothing that day. She had set his phone back exactly as she found it, continued making dinner, and said nothing because she had needed time to think. She had been thinking ever since, and what she had arrived at after months of it was a clarity she had not expected. She did not want to spend 18 months in this room. She did not want to spend $80,000 fighting for a share of a house that had been impressive, but had not in the truest sense been home. She did not want Owen calling from London with that specific strain in his voice she recognized as the sound of a child placed involuntarily in the middle of something too large for the middle to hold, to spend another year and a half watching his parents try to damage each other in a Columbus courtroom. She did not want what the mansion represented. She had spent enough time in the extended stay hotel to understand that the mansion had represented something she no longer wanted to be. The woman who lived in a space designed to impress people she did not particularly like, at a scale she had never chosen in a life that had gradually come to belong less to her than to the idea of what a woman in her position was supposed to want. She wanted something else. She had wanted it since April, since the morning she sat in the hotel room and took her key ring from her purse and held it in her palm. Most of the keys she could name. The car, the hotel room, the safe deposit box at First Meridian. And one more, old brass, slightly worn smooth where her fingers had held it over decades, heavier than it looked, the kind of key that belonged to a door built to last. A key she had been carrying for 31 years without until recently fully understanding why she had never taken it off. I have a decision, Constance said to Winifred. When they returned to the courtroom and the judge called the proceedings back to order, Constance asked to speak. The judge, a woman in her late 60s with the tiredness of someone who had presided over too many of these proceedings to find any of them surprising, granted permission. Constance stood. Your Honor, she said, and her voice was steadier than she had expected. I would like to renounce my claim to the marital home and accept a settlement of $100,000. I believe this will allow us to conclude these proceedings without further cost or a conflict to either party. The room went quiet in the way rooms do when something unexpected happens, the silence of people adjusting to new information. Winifred gripped her arm. Constance, you cannot. I can, Constance said quietly, and I am. The judge looked at her. Mrs. Aldridge, I want to be certain you understand the terms of what you are proposing. You are renouncing rights to a property currently assessed at $3.2 million in exchange for a cash settlement of $100,000. This agreement would be legally binding upon signature. I understand, Your Honor. Constance held the judge's gaze. I'm 69 years old. I don't have years to spend fighting over things that can be counted and divided. I'd prefer to spend whatever time I have building something I can't quantify. The judge held her gaze for a moment longer than strictly required. Then she nodded. When the paperwork was signed and the proceedings formally concluded, Garrison stood. For the first time that day, for the first time in what felt like much longer, he looked at her. You'll regret this, he said. His voice was controlled and cold, the voice he used in professional situations when he wanted to communicate certainty without revealing anything beneath it. When you realize you have nowhere to go and no one to take care of you, you'll regret giving up everything. Constance picked up her purse. She felt the weight of the key ring inside it, the particular heft of the old brass key among the others. I'm not giving up everything, Garrison, she said. I'm giving up nothing that matters. There's a difference. She walked out of the courthouse into the June afternoon. The sun was the kind Ohio produces in early summer, warm and direct and uncomplicated. She stood on the courthouse steps for a moment and breathed it in. Then she got in her car and drove to 22 Birchwood Lane. The drive took 40 minutes through neighborhood transitions Columbus had been making for decades downtown, giving way to older commercial quarters, which gave way to residential streets where the houses were modest and close together, and the yards had chain-link fences and the driveways held the practical vehicles of people whose lives were organized around function rather than appearance. She had driven this road in her memory many times over the past 3 months. She had not driven it in person since the spring of 1993, the year Garrison's career had taken its most significant upward turn, and they had left the small house on Birchwood Lane for the larger world his success required. She had been 38 years old that spring. Owen had been 6.5. She had packed his room last because his room was the hardest, and she had stood in the doorway looking at the growth chart marks on the doorframe, pencil marks in her own handwriting, the accumulated record of a small person becoming larger. And she had told herself she would paint over them before the new family moved in. She had not done it because doing it would have meant standing in the room with a paintbrush while Owen waited in the car, and she had not been able to make herself do that. She had locked the door of 22 Birchwood Lane in the spring of 1993 and put the key on her keyring and never taken it off. 31 years. She turned onto Birchwood Lane and pulled up in front of number 22 and sat with the engine off looking at it. The house was small. She had known it was small. She had lived in it for 7 years and carried its dimensions in her body the way you carry the proportions of early spaces, the way a room you knew as a child fits inside you regardless of how many larger rooms come after. But knowing a thing and seeing it are different, and seeing it now after 3 months in the extended stay hotel and 42 years in the kind of spaces Garrison's career provided, she felt the smallness of it differently than she had expected. Not diminished. The word that came to her was honest. The house looked honest. One story, maybe 1,200 square feet with white aluminum siding, gone gray with weather, and years a front porch that sagged on the left side where a support post had settled a front yard, where the grass had grown into something closer to meadow. Then lawn, a mailbox leaning at an angle that suggested it had been considering this posture for some time. The windows were intact but dusty. The front door was faded from whatever red it had been painted when she last stood in front of it to something closer to dried roses. It looked like a house that had been waiting. She got out of the car. She carried her single suitcase to the porch. The key was old and the lock had the resistance of a mechanism that had not been operated in decades, but it gave eventually the way things may correctly give when the right application of patience is applied, and the door swung inward. The smell reached her before the sight did. Dust and closed air and the faint mineral note of a house sealed against weather for a long time. And beneath all of that, something older and harder to name, the particular atmospheric residue of a space where life had been lived, where ordinary and extraordinary things had happened in the ordinary way that extraordinary things usually happen, without announcement in the middle of other things. She stepped inside. The living room was exactly the size she remembered, filled with the golden dimness of a space where the windows had gone dirty enough to filter the light, but not block it entirely. The hardwood floors were under a layer of grime, and in several places a scattering of debris. The years had accumulated a desiccated leaf that had found its way under the door dust, organized along the baseboards with the patient industry of entropy. The ceiling was high for a small house, one of the things she had always loved about it, and it was intact, no water stains, no cracks of consequence. She walked through slowly. The kitchen, where she had made Owen's birthday cakes, on the counter to the left of the sink, where the light came in from the east in the mornings and hit the yellow wall. The walls were still yellow, faded now to the color of old butter, and made the whole room feel held inside something warm. The bathroom, small and functional. The tiles original to the house's 1950s construction, white with a border of pale blue. The master bedroom, dusty and still full of a silence that felt inhabited rather than empty. And then Owen's room. She stood in the doorway and looked at the doorframe. The marks were still there. She had known they would be. She had known it the moment she stood in the same doorway in the spring of 1993 and understood she could not bring herself to paint over them. But knowing and seeing are different, and what she felt standing in the doorway of her son's childhood room in the dusty June afternoon, looking at the record of his early growth in her own handwriting was something that did not fit inside any words she had available for feelings. She traced them with her finger, starting at the bottom, 6 months, 1 year, 18 months, 2 years. She followed them upward, her finger moving from mark to mark in mom, way a person moves point to point on a map of territory they have already traveled, recognizing each position as a place they once stood, remembering what it was like to stand there. 3 years, 4, 5, 6.5. The last mark, made on a Saturday morning in March of 1993, Owen in his pajamas with his back against the doorframe and his chin lifted the way children lift their chins when they understand that being measured requires a certain dignity of posture. She had made the mark and written the number, and he had turned around to see how high it was, and she had told him, and he had said with the complete satisfaction of a 6-year-old who has received important information that's pretty tall, it was the last measurement she had taken in this house. She stood with her finger resting on the mark for a moment. Then she let her hand fall and she went to the kitchen and began to do what needed doing. She had bought cleaning supplies that afternoon before coming to Birchwood Lane. Light bulbs and basic necessities, and a mop and a bucket, and several kinds of cleaner, understanding that the house would need work before it was livable, and that work was something she could do. She had been doing work her entire adult life. She was capable of more kinds of it than Garrison had ever bothered to understand. She scrubbed, she swept, she opened windows to let the June air move through the rooms, pushing the sealed staleness out and replacing it with the ordinary smell of a summer evening in a residential neighborhood, cut grass and car exhaust, and someone's dinner cooking a few houses down. She made the bathroom functional. She made Owen's old room clean enough to sleep in. She worked until her hands were tired and her back ached and the light had gone from gold to gray to the deep blue of an Ohio summer evening. When she finally stopped, she stood at the kitchen sink and looked out the window at the backyard. Overgrown entirely, the flower beds she had maintained, reduced to undifferentiated green, the garden she put in during the summer of 1990, long since returned to whatever vegetation had decided to occupy the space. But the yard was intact. The maple in the back corner she had planted the spring after Owen was born, now mature and substantial, its branches extending in the unhurried way of trees that have had decades to become what they are. She had planted that tree. She had bought it as a sapling from a nursery on Morse Road for $11.75 and dug the hole herself on a Saturday afternoon while Owen napped because Garrison had been working, which was where Garrison had always been. She had planted it and watered it and watched it from this window for 7 years until the year they left, and she had not seen it since. It was large now. Properly large, the kind that creates shade rather than simply occupies space. She looked at it in the blue evening light and felt something she had to sit with for a moment to identify correctly. She felt glad she had planted it. She slept on the floor of Owen's room that night in a sleeping bag, and she woke in the middle of the night to the sound of rain on the windows and lay there listening to it, and she was not afraid, and she was not sad exactly, and she understood that whatever she felt was something that did not yet have a name, but was not the absence of one. It was the presence of something that had not been present for a long time, something that felt in the rainy dark of Owen's old room, like the early stages of something rather than the end of something. In the morning she woke to sunlight. Her body registered the hard floor with the honest complaint of a 69-year-old back that had not been consulted before the sleeping arrangement was made. She stood carefully and stretched and moved through the house in the morning light, which was different from the evening light, more direct and less forgiving, showing the dust and the work still to be done with the impartial clarity of daylight. She made coffee on the small drip machine she had brought from the hotel, standing at the kitchen counter with the June morning coming in through the window she had left open overnight, listening to the sounds of the neighborhood waking up. A dog somewhere, a car starting on the next block, the distant percussion of a garbage truck making its rounds. The ordinary music of a residential street on an ordinary morning, sounds she had almost forgotten existed because the neighborhood on Whitfield Drive was the kind where distances between houses were sufficient to muffle the evidence of other lives being lived. She was still standing there when the knock came at the front door. The woman on the porch was in her early 60s with gray-streaked hair, in a practical cut, wearing a garden-stained shirt and carrying a casserole dish with both hands and, the expression of someone who had decided to do a thing and was going to do it without making a production of it. "Hi," the woman said. "I'm Norma Briggs. I'm at 24. She nodded toward the house next door. "I saw lights on last night and figured someone was moving in. Brought this. It's a chicken and rice thing. Nothing special." Constance looked at the casserole dish. She looked at the woman holding it. She thought about the last time a neighbor had brought her food and could not remember one. "Thank you," she said. "That's very kind. Are you renting or buying?" "I own it. I lived here years ago." Constance paused. "I'm starting over." Norma's expression shifted not to pity, which Constance had been bracing against for 3 months, but to something more useful: recognition. The look of a woman who understood what starting over meant because she had relevant experience of her own. "Welcome back, then. I'm at 24 if you need anything. I mean that directly, not the way people say it when they don't." After Norma left, Constance sat on the kitchen floor with the casserole dish and a fork she had found in the back of a drawer, and she ate directly from the dish. Not because she lacked a bowl, but because sitting on the kitchen floor eating from a casserole dish was the most honest thing she had done in as long as she could remember. And honesty was something she needed in large quantities right now. It was the best meal she had eaten in months. Not because of the food, which was good, but not remarkable, but because of what it represented: the uncomplicated generosity of a neighbor who had seen a light on and decided the appropriate response was a casserole. The mansion on Whitfield Drive had never had a neighbor who brought a casserole. She ate slowly. When she was done, she set the dish aside and she sat for a while longer on the kitchen floor, thinking about what she had said in the courtroom, about spending whatever time she had left building something she could not quantify, about the difference between giving things up and giving up nothing that matters. She had said those things with conviction, and she had meant them, but meaning something in a courtroom and living it in a dusty kitchen on a residential street, 40 minutes outside the city, were different kinds of meaning, and she was sitting on the floor trying to understand the difference when she remembered the cabinet. She had been meaning to go through the kitchen cabinets since the previous evening, but had run out of light and energy before she reached them. She got up and opened the cabinet under the sink, expecting cleaning supplies left behind by no one, and found instead what appeared to be nothing: a dry mop handle, a rusted can of something unidentifiable, and at the back of the cabinet, pushed against the wall and partially obscured by the mop handle, a tin box. She had to reach to get it. The tin was roughly the size of a large shoebox, dark green, with a lid that fit by friction, the kind of container that might have held cookies in some earlier era and been repurposed afterward. It was heavier than it looked. She set it on the kitchen table and looked at it. She knew it not consciously, not in the sense of remembering a specific instance of seeing it before, but in the deeper way of recognizing something that has been part of the atmosphere of a life. Her father had kept things in boxes like this. He had been a man who understood the value of physical documents, who trusted paper over promises, who believed that the most important protections were the ones you put in writing and kept somewhere safe. She opened the lid. Inside, carefully placed and separated by a piece of wax paper, were 2 items. The first was a document, several pages stapled on paper with the texture of legal instruments produced with care some decades ago. She unfolded it and began to read, and within 3 paragraphs, she understood what she was holding: a trust deed. The legal instrument by which a property had been placed in trust for the benefit of a named beneficiary, executed and witnessed and notarized, dated the 14th day of November 1979. The property described a residential dwelling in at 22 Birchwood Lane, Columbus, Ohio. The beneficiary named Constance Eleanor Aldridge née Pemberton. She had to read it twice. 1979. She had been 24 years old in November of 1979. She had not met Garrison until the following spring. She had not married him until 1982. This document predated her marriage by 3 years, predated her even knowing the man who would become her husband, predated the entire architecture of the life she had just left by half a decade. Her father had put this house in a trust for her in 1979. He had done it before she married, before she had any reason to believe she might someday need the protection such an instrument would provide. He had done it when she was 24, and he was in his late 50s and presumably thinking about things that a man thinks about when he has a daughter he loves, and an understanding of the way the world works, and a belief, apparently, that his daughter might someday need a place that belonged to her alone. She set the trust deed down carefully. She picked up the second item, a letter. Her father's handwriting, which she would have known anywhere, the precise and slightly formal penmanship of a man who had learned to write in an era when handwriting was considered a form of character. The date at the top, March the 3rd, 1993. The month they had left this house. She read it slowly. Connie, if you're reading this, I'm gone. I asked your mother to make sure this box stayed in this house when you moved, and I trust she managed it. You know I never asked much of her on practical matters, but this one I made very clear. I put this house in a trust for you in 1979, 3 years before you married Garrison. I didn't tell you because I didn't want to have a conversation about why I was doing it. The answer to that question would have been complicated, and I was not a man who navigated complicated conversations well. Your mother will tell you that's an understatement. What I want you to understand is this: the house is yours, not yours and anyone else's, not subject to any claim from any direction. I made certain of that with the trust, and I made certain of the trust with a lawyer I trusted, and I made certain the lawyer's work was sound by having a second lawyer review it. I was thorough because I loved you and because I understood enough about the way things can go in a life to believe that having a place of your own, completely of your own, was not a luxury. It was a necessity. You were always stronger than you knew. I always believed that. I believed that you would make your way through whatever came because you were made of materials that hold up under pressure. But I also believe that even people made of those materials need somewhere to come back to. This is that place. I love you, Connie. I always have, and I always will, whatever always means from where I'm going. Your father. She set the letter on the kitchen table beside the trust deed. She sat down in the chair that remained in the house, the single chair, its wooden seat worn smooth. And she sat, and she did not try to manage what happened next. She had been managing things for 3 months, managing grief and anger, and the logistics of a dissolution, and the telephone calls from Owen, and the meetings with Winifred, and the careful professional composure required by every public-facing moment of the worst period of her adult life. She had been managing, and she was good at it, and she was tired of it. She put her hands flat on the table, and she cried. Not quietly, not with the restrained and dignified grief she had permitted herself in the hotel room in the evenings when no one could hear. She cried the way her father's letter deserved, fully and without apology for him and for the house and for the 1979 version of a man who had loved his daughter enough to think 45 years ahead, to put the protection in place before the threat existed, to leave a letter in a tin box under a kitchen sink with the faith that someday she would find it and understand. He had known. He had known in the way that people who pay attention to the people they love sometimes know things without being told them directly, that his daughter might someday need a door she could return to that no one else had a key for. He had made that door. He had kept it waiting. She sat at the table for a long time after the crying was done. Then she washed her face at the kitchen sink and made more coffee and read both documents again, carefully from beginning to end. What she was holding was a legal instrument that placed 22 Birchwood Lane entirely outside the category of marital property. Because the trust had been established by a third party, her father, 3 years prior to her marriage. And because it had never been commingled with marital accounts or used as collateral for marital debt, it was not subject to division and divorce proceedings. It had never needed to be declared in those proceedings. It was hers in the most complete and protected sense of the word, hers, in a way no court and no attorney and no amount of Garrison's money could change. She sat with this understanding. Then she thought about what Garrison had said in the courtroom. When you realize you have nowhere to go and no one to take care of you. The specific confidence in his voice when he said it, the certainty of a man who had assessed the situation and concluded that he held the decisive advantage. He had not known about the tin box. In 42 years of marriage, she had never told him about the trust, partly because she had not fully understood it herself until this moment, partly because her father had never explained it while he was alive, and partly because there were things a woman kept in the private territory of herself that had nothing to do with keeping secrets and everything to do with keeping self. Garrison had done his calculations without knowing about the tin box under the kitchen sink. His calculations were wrong. 3 days passed, 3 days in which Constance worked on the house with the focused energy of a woman who understood that physical and immediate and productive work was the best antidote to the kind of thinking that led nowhere. She found a hardware store on Livingston Avenue and bought supplies. She scrubbed and repaired and opened windows and carried out years of accumulated debris and made the kitchen functional and the bathroom clean and one bedroom properly livable. Norma Briggs appeared on the second day with a box of tools she said her late husband had left behind and which were taking up space in her garage, offered with the practical generosity of a woman who understood that offered tools were more useful than offered sympathy. On the morning of the fourth day, Constance was sitting on the front porch with coffee when the gray Mercedes pulled onto Birchwood Lane and stopped in front of number 22. She watched Garrison get out of the car. He was still a physically imposing man, 71 years old, well-maintained, in the way of men who had always had the resources for it, with the posture of someone who had never seriously questioned his own authority to occupy whatever space he found himself in. He stood on the sidewalk in front of her house and looked at it the way he had always looked at things that did not meet his standards, not with hostility exactly, but with the patient and slightly surprised expression of someone encountering a level of quality beneath what they had expected. He had not called ahead. He had not asked if it was convenient. He had simply arrived because Garrison Aldridge had always operated from the assumption that his arrival required no prior negotiation. "This is where you ended up," he said. He did not say hello. "This is where I chose to be," Constance said. He came up the porch steps. He stood looking at the house with his hands in his pockets in the way he stood when he was in a situation he considered beneath his engagement, but felt required his presence. "Constance, you're 69 years old. You can't live like this." "I'm living quite well, actually. I talked to my attorney." He turned to look at her. "The settlement can be revisited. If you're willing to reconsider, there may be room to negotiate something more appropriate to your needs." She looked at him. This was what he had come for, not contrition, not any variety of the acknowledgement she had stopped expecting years ago. He had come because something in his calculations had been disrupted. Most likely Claudette, most likely whatever was currently not going according to plan on that particular front, and he had decided in the way he made all his decisions that the most efficient solution was to return to a position that had previously been manageable. She was the manageable position. "I'm not coming back, Garrison. You're being unrealistic." "I'm being exactly realistic. I know where I am and what I have and what I'm doing. You drove 40 minutes to tell me what I already know." She picked up her coffee mug. "I think you should go." His expression shifted not to anger, which would have required him to feel something more urgent than controlled displeasure. "When you run out of money, what then? $100,000 isn't a retirement plan. You think you can sustain this on Social Security?" Constance set her mug down with deliberate care. "I survived raising Owen while you worked 100-hour weeks. I survived managing a household on your starting salary when we had nothing and you were figuring out who you wanted to be professionally. I survived your divorce papers left beside the coffee maker on my 69th birthday." She paused. "I think I can manage this." The phone in Garrison's jacket pocket began to vibrate. He did not take it out, but the involuntary stillness that moved through him told her everything. He knew who it was. She could tell from the quality of that stillness. He knew, and the knowledge was not entirely comfortable. "You should probably answer that," Constance said. "It might be Claudette." Something crossed his face that she could not entirely categorize. He looked at her for one more moment. Then he went back down the porch steps, got in the gray Mercedes, and pulled away from 22 Birchwood Lane without looking back. Constance sat on her porch with her coffee and watched him go. Her hands were shaking slightly. She noticed this without alarm, the way you notice weather from inside a house. It was the residue of the encounter, the physiological evidence of 42 years of conditioning that could not be entirely overwritten in 4 days. Her body still remembered that Garrison's displeasure was a condition requiring management. Her mind was working on persuading her body otherwise, but these things took time. She sat until the shaking passed. The neighborhood went about its business around her. A man with a body walked past and nodded. 2 children on bicycles navigated the sidewalk with the focused intensity of the very young. Somewhere on the block, someone had a radio playing an oldies station, something from the late 60s that she recognized without being able to name. Norma appeared from the direction of number 24, with 2 cups of coffee and the expression of someone who had been watching from an appropriate distance and had decided that the appropriate distance had been maintained long enough. She handed Constance a cup and sat in the other porch chair, the one with the cracked armrest, without asking if it was free. Ex-husband, she said. That obvious, the poem, Norma said simply, and the posture. Constance looked at her. Then she looked back at the street where the Mercedes had been. She thought about the trust deed in the tin box on the kitchen table. She thought about her father in 1979, thinking 45 years ahead on behalf of a daughter he loved. She thought about this key on her ring that she had carried for 31 years without fully knowing what it unlocked. He thinks I have nowhere to go, she said. Looks to me like you're exactly where you should be, Norma said. The evening settled around the porch. The radio down the street changed songs. The light went from gold to amber to the deep blue of an Ohio summer evening, the sky above the rooftops of Birchwood Lane, holding the last of the day's warmth slowly and without urgency, as if there were no reason to let go of anything good. Constance held her coffee cup in both hands and breathed. She was 69 years old. She had $100,000 in a house her father had protected for her before she knew she needed protecting, and she had no plan beyond the morning and no map beyond the knowledge that maps are made by moving. She did not know what was coming. She knew something was because something always was. And because the clarity she had arrived at in that courthouse was not the end of a story, but the beginning of one, and beginnings required walking into the unknown with the faith that your feet would find ground. But for now, tonight, she was here. And here for the first time in longer than she could properly remember felt like exactly the right place to be. The porch took 3 weeks. Constance had not known before this summer that she was the kind of person who could spend 3 weeks on a porch. She had not known a great many things about herself before this summer, because the version of herself she had been for the past 4 decades had not been given the circumstances to find out. That version had been competent and organized and productive in the ways that a household of Garrison's scale required, capable of managing caterers and contractors, and the social obligations of a life lived at a certain altitude, capable of raising a son largely on her own, while his father worked the hours that investment banking required of the people it consumed. But capable with a hammer and a pry bar and a circular saw she had initially been afraid to plug in that had been outside the available data. Dylan Briggs arrived on a Monday morning at 7:45 with a truck bed full of lumber and the unhurried manner of a 25-year-old who had learned his trade from someone who insisted on doing things correctly the first time. He was Norma's nephew, and the connection mattered because it said something about the Briggs family, which turned out to be extensive in the way families are extensive when they stay in a neighborhood across generations and accumulate the ordinary bonds of proximity and mutual obligation. He assessed the porch the way people who genuinely understand structures assess them, not from a distance, pronouncing general verdicts, but close crouching to look at the underside of the decking, pressing his thumb against boards to test their resistance, examining the joints where the support posts met the foundation with the focused attention of someone reading a language they knew fluently. "Good bones," he said finally. "This porch isn't failing. It's just been ignored. How long will it take? Depends on how much you want to help." He looked at her without the particular assessment that people sometimes brought to questions about what a 69-year-old woman could do physically. He looked at her the way he had looked at the porch, as a situation requiring honest evaluation rather than social management. "I can do it faster alone, but it'll cost more. If you're willing to learn, you can do the demo and prep work while I handle the structural. Cut the cost by about a third." "Teach me," Constance said. He taught her. He was patient in the way of someone who had learned patience as a professional requirement rather than a personality trait, patient, without condescension, willing to show the same thing twice, without making the second showing feel like a failure on her part. She learned how to identify boards needing replacement versus ones needing only cleaning and sealing. She learned how to use the pry bar to remove rotted decking without damaging the joist beneath. She learned how to measure twice and the reason why. She learned that her hands, which had managed 42 years of household administration, were entirely capable of holding a nail gun once someone showed her it was a tool rather than a threat. Her palms developed blisters that became calluses. Her shoulders ached in the evenings in a way completely different from the tension headaches and low-grade stress of her previous life. This ache was honest. It was the ache of a body that had done something real and was registering the evidence of it. Norma brought lunch on most days, appearing at noon with sandwiches and the no-nonsense generosity of a woman who did not make a ceremony of kindness, who simply identified what was needed and provided it and did not require acknowledgement beyond the basic acknowledgement of a person accepting what was offered. Constance was learning to accept help without the discomfort that a certain kind of self-sufficiency produces in people raised to believe that needing things is a form of weakness. It was not weakness. She was coming to understand that. It was simply the condition of being a person among other people. On the second Thursday of July, Norma mentioned the garden, a community garden 3 blocks north of Birchwood Lane on a lot that had been vacant for years before a woman named Beatrice Fowler, who was 73 and operated at an energy level that made people decades younger tired just watching her, had organized the neighborhood into doing something about it. The garden was 4 years old now, established in raised beds built from reclaimed lumber, with a small greenhouse for starting seedlings and composting bins, painted the color of new grass in a tool shed. Beatrice had decorated with hand-lettered signs containing instructions, encouragements, and the occasional observation about the relationship between patience and soil that sounded simple until you sat with it long enough. Constance went on a Tuesday morning. The garden was more alive than she had expected. Not just vegetable alive, the practical productivity of things growing toward harvest, but people alive in the way that spaces become when they have been consistently inhabited by people who care about them. There were perhaps a dozen people working when she arrived, ranging from a young mother with an infant strapped to her chest to an elderly man who moved slowly but did not stop moving, and Beatrice Fowler, who moved faster than anyone else and stopped for nothing. Beatrice introduced her around with the efficiency of someone who understood that belonging required connection, and connection required knowing names. This is Constance. She's on Birchwood. She's starting over. She said it without drama, as a statement of relevant context rather than a confession requiring sympathy. Someone handed her gloves. Someone showed her which row needed weeding. She began working. The man beside her in the adjacent row was named Everett Grady, a veteran in his mid-60s with the quality of stillness that some people carry out of experiences that have permanently altered their relationship with noise. He grew herbs, primarily rosemary and thyme, and 2 varieties of sage and a stand of lavender along the eastern border of his plot that he tended with a precision suggesting the growing of things had become for him a way of practicing something he needed to practice. They worked in comfortable silence before Everett said without preamble, "Heard you came back to Birchwood after a long time away." 31 years, he considered this. Took some nerve. Or some stupidity, Constance said. I haven't decided which yet. Everett almost smiled. Usually looks the same from the outside. She came back Thursday. She came back the following Saturday. By the end of July, she was a Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday person at the garden, the designation Beatrice used for the core membership, the people who showed up regardless of weather or competing obligations, the people around whom the garden's rhythm organized itself. It was at the garden on a Thursday morning in early August that she first properly met Rosalind Farmer. Roz had been coming to the garden for about 2 months, Beatrice told Constance, since shortly after her husband passed. She came irregularly, sometimes staying 2 hours, sometimes appearing for 20 minutes, and leaving with the distracted air of someone who had intended to stay longer and found that she could not. She was in her late 60s, with gray hair worn in a braid down her back, and the quality of a person in the process of learning to exist inside a life substantially altered by a loss she had not finished processing. Constance recognized it because she had been wearing a version of it herself since March. She found Roz one morning standing at the border of her plot looking at the green bean plants with an expression that had nothing to do with green beans. "They're not doing anything wrong," Constance said, "in case you were judging them." Roz looked up. Something in her face shifted from wherever it had been to the present. "Sorry, I was somewhere else." "I know the feeling." Constance picked up the spare pair of gloves from her trug. "Come help me with the tomatoes. They need staking and it's better with 2 people." Roz came. They worked. They talked in the way people talk when their hands are occupied more honestly than they might have otherwise because the hands provide a certain cover for the voice, a plausible direction for the attention that makes words feel less exposed. Roz's husband had died in February. 6 months ago, a cardiac event quick at home on a Sunday morning while he was making breakfast. She had come downstairs to the smell of coffee and found him on the kitchen floor, and the paramedics had confirmed what the stillness of him had already told her. Constance listened without interpolating her own experience into Roz's. She had learned somewhere in the past months that grief required spaciousness in its listeners, that the impulse to respond to someone else's pain with comparable pain of your own, however well-intentioned, was a way of taking up room that was not yours to take. When Roz finished, Constance said, "I'm at 22 Birchwood. I cook on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday evenings. I'd like a cooking partner, someone to share the meal with." Roz looked at her. "You don't know me." "I know enough," Constance said. "You show up on hard days. That tells me what I need to know." Roz came on Monday. She came on Wednesday. By the third week, it was understood between them without being stated that this was a standing arrangement. By the fourth week, Roz had begun bringing ingredients for recipes she wanted to try, and by the fifth week, Constance's small kitchen had become a place where two women who had each sustained a significant loss compared notes on the process of continuing, which is different from recovering and different from moving on, and requires its own vocabulary that they were developing between themselves as they cooked. It was on a Wednesday evening in mid-August, 3 days after Constance had noticed that Roz's laughter was becoming more frequent and less effortful, that Dylan arrived with his uncle. He knocked at the door at 6 o'clock while Constance and Roz were in the middle of a recipe that had been more ambitious than the available equipment could support, and Constance opened the door with flour on her forearm and the look of someone interrupted at a critical stage. "Miss Constance," Dylan said, "this is my Uncle Harold. I mentioned you'd been asking about the kitchen cabinets." The man behind Dylan was 68 with gray hair worn short and hands that told the story of his life. In their configuration, the wideness of a craftsman's hands calluses, in specific places the way he held them slightly away from his sides in the unconscious posture of someone accustomed to having a tool in them. He had a face that had weathered honestly and brown eyes that looked at things directly in the way of people with no ongoing project of making impressions. "Harold Sutton," he said, "related to Beatrice Fowler by marriage on her late husband's side. Dylan said you had original cabinets worth saving." "Come look," Constance said, and stepped aside. Harold examined the kitchen cabinets with the same focused attention Dylan had given the porch. He opened the doors. He examined the joints. He ran his hand along the face frames in the way a doctor palpates something to understand what is underneath the surface. "These are original to the house," he said. "Good solid wood under here. The paint's a mess, but that's not structural. That's just years of people painting over painting without preparation." He turned to look at her. "I could teach you how to strip these and refinish them if you're interested. It's not technically difficult, it's just time." "I seem to have time," Constance said. They started the following week. Harold came on Tuesday and Thursday evenings after his work, which was cabinetry and finished carpentry for a small firm in Westerville that had employed him on a flexible basis for the past 3 years since his wife Ruth had died, and he had found that full-time work was more than he wanted, but complete retirement was not something he was ready for. He was a person who needed to make things with his hands, and the half-time arrangement gave him enough of that without consuming the rest of his life. He taught her how to strip the old paint chemical stripper, applied with a brush left to work, then removed with a scraper in the direction of the grain. Patient, methodical, never rushed. He taught her how to sand through the grits, starting coarse and finishing fine, how to feel when the wood was ready for the next stage, rather than relying only on what the eye reported. He taught her how to apply stain in long, even strokes and how to let it breathe before adding finish. They worked in the way people work when the work itself provides sufficient structure for everything else that happens alongside it, talking sometimes, sitting in comfortable silence at other times, the radio, providing something from the 50s and 60s that neither of them needed to pay attention to in order to enjoy. Harold had opinions about woodworking and just says, and the satisfaction of making something that would outlast you. He had no opinions about things that were not his business, which was a quality Constance found increasingly rare and valuable. He had been widowed for 8 years. His 3 children, scattered between Columbus and Cincinnati, In a suburb of Pittsburgh worried about him in the specific way adult children worry about widowed parents who insist on working and living independently, a worry that was entirely love and only partly useful. He understood this and was patient with it because patience was the most productive response to most things. He stayed for dinner after the first cabinet session because Constance had made enough for three and Roz had texted to say she was not feeling well. He stayed after the second because the conversation had not finished when the work stopped. After the third, he brought a bottle of wine, the unspoken acknowledgement that staying for dinner had become an expectation rather than a surprise. And the transition from unexpected to expected is the entire geography of how one person becomes a regular presence in another person's life. Constance noticed all of this and did not label it. She had learned that labeling things prematurely was a way of making them into something other than what they were. What this was for now was a man who came on Tuesday and Thursday evenings and taught her to refinish cabinets and stayed for dinner and was easy to be around. That was sufficient as a description. It did not require anything added to it. The call from Owen came on a Friday evening. She was in the kitchen with Roz attempting a new recipe that was not going as the photograph suggested it should, and she would have let it go to voicemail, except that Owen called at specific times on specific evenings, and a Friday call was outside the pattern, which meant it was something he had decided to do rather than something that had arrived at its scheduled time. She answered. His voice had a quality she recognized from his childhood, the voice he used when he had been asked to report something he was not certain how she would receive. Careful, the voice of someone who had been thinking about what they were going to say. "Mom," he said, "I need to tell you something and I want you to hear it from me." "Go ahead, Owen." "Dad called." He paused. "He wants me to come home. He said he's been thinking about what happens when you both get older and he wants the family closer." Another pause. "He said if Claire and I bring the kids back to Columbus, we can live at the Whitfield house. The whole thing. No rent. He said there's more than enough space." The kitchen was quiet. Roz had set down her spatula. Constance looked at the window above the sink. Outside the backyard, Maple was visible in the blithio evening light and a substantial and settled thing, a tree that had become entirely what it was meant to be. "I see," she said. "I wanted you to know because I think he's—" Owen stopped, started again. "I think he thinks that if I'm at Whitfield, that keeps things connected. Or maybe makes things more complicated for you. I don't know exactly what he's thinking. I wanted to be honest with you about what he said." "I appreciate that," Constance said. "Mom." His voice shifted into something more direct. "What do you want me to do?" She thought about it. She thought about the trust deed and Winifred's voice confirming she had read it correctly. She thought about Garrison's legal maneuver, which she had not yet told Owen about in an attempt to apply pressure from multiple directions at once. She thought about what it meant to answer this question honestly and what it meant to answer it in a way that protected Owen from the weight of a position she should not be asking him to hold. "I want you to do whatever is right for your family," she said. "I mean that entirely. Whatever arrangement makes the most sense for Claire and the children and for your work, that's what matters. You don't need to factor me into this decision as a variable." "You're not a variable," Owen said. "I know, but I'm also not a reason to make a choice you wouldn't otherwise make. Do you understand what I'm saying?" A silence, long enough that she knew he was considering it genuinely. "I understand," he said finally. "Good. However this lands, Owen, I'm your mother. That doesn't change with geography." After the call, she set the phone on the counter and stood at the window for a moment looking at the yard. Roz, who had been very still in the way people are still when they understand that what is happening in a room is not for them to interrupt, said nothing. Constance turned from the window. "The recipe," she said, "I think we overcomplicated it. Let's simplify." They simplified it. They ate. They talked about other things, and the food was good and the kitchen was warm. What Constance did not say to Roz, what she had not said to anyone, was that she was afraid. Not of Garrison's legal motion, which would fail, and not of the house, which was safe, but of a simpler thing. She was afraid that Owen would choose the larger space and the easier comfort and the familiar pull of his father's world, and that she would understand it when it happened, and even forgive it and still feel it as the particular loneliness of a parent who has been weighed against something and found lighter. She carried this fear quietly and kept working. The morning of the last Wednesday of August, Constance was at the garden with Beatrice, when her phone rang with a Columbus area code she did not recognize. The voice on the other end identified itself as belonging to a paralegal in the offices of Prescott and Whitfield Garrison's attorney's firm. The voice delivered its message with the professional neutrality of someone communicating something unpleasant, without wishing to be held responsible for its unpleasantness. The message Garrison Aldridge was filing a motion with the Franklin County Court of Common Pleas to vacate the divorce settlement on the grounds that his former spouse had withheld a significant asset during proceedings, specifically the residential property at 22 Birchwood Lane. The filing requested a complete review of the settlement terms and potential recovery of the $100,000 already dispersed. After the call ended, Constance stood in the garden with her phone in her hand for a moment. Beatrice looked at her. "Trouble? My ex-husband," Constance said. "He's trying to take the house." She went home. She sat at the kitchen table with the tin box open in front of her, both documents laid flat, the trust deed and her father's letter. She read the trust deed again. Then again. Then she sat back in her chair and thought. She could call Winifred now. She probably should call Winifred now. She did not call Winifred yet. Instead, she opened her laptop and began to read. She read about trust law in Ohio. She read about the distinction between separate property and marital property in divorce proceedings. She read about what constituted a marital asset and under what circumstances property held in an irrevocable trust established by a third party prior to a marriage was or was not required to be disclosed during those proceedings. She read for 4 hours. She made notes on a legal pad in her clear handwriting. She looked up terms she did not understand and read about those and made more notes. She was 69 years old and had spent 42 years managing complex household administration and the application of focused intelligence to a problem requiring sustained reading and logical organization was not a skill she lacked. It was simply a skill she had been applying for 4 decades to a narrower set of problems than it was capable of addressing. By the time the afternoon light was coming through the kitchen window at the angle preceding evening, she had a clear picture of what she was looking at. The trust had been established by her father, a third party, in 1979, 3 years before her marriage. It was irrevocable, its terms unalterable, and Constance was the sole beneficiary. Because it had been established by a third party prior to the marriage, and because the property had never been used as collateral for marital debt, never deposited into any joint account, never in any legally operative way commingled with marital assets, it fell cleanly into the category of separate property under Ohio law. Property of this kind was not a marital asset. Property that was not a marital asset was not subject to disclosure requirements in divorce proceedings. Garrison's motion had no legal foundation. His attorney almost certainly knew this, which meant the motion was not a legal strategy. It was a pressure strategy, filed not because Prescott believed it would succeed, but because filing it cost Garrison money. He could absorb, and fighting it would cost Constance money she could not as easily afford. And because the process of fighting it, the correspondence, the appearances, the sustained anxiety of a legal challenge, pending was itself a form of erosion that he was counting on. She understood this with a clarity not accompanied by fear, but by something colder and more useful. She picked up her phone and called Winifred Cobb. "Winifred," she said when the call connected, "I've been reading about trust law in Ohio for the past 4 hours, and I think I already understand why Garrison's motion has no legal merit. I need you to confirm that I'm reading this correctly and then file the appropriate response." A pause, then, "Tell me what you've read." Constance went through it. The trust establishment date, the irrevocable structure, the third-party grantor, the absence of commingling, the Ohio statute distinguishing separate property from marital property. She went through it in the order she had organized it on her legal pad, systematically without hurrying. When she finished, Winifred was quiet for a moment. "You've read it correctly," Winifred said. "The motion has no legal foundation. It will be dismissed." "How long?" "If I file the response this week, I'd expect a ruling within 10 days. 2 weeks at most." "File it this week," Constance said. "And Winifred, I want the response to be thorough. I want it to establish clearly that this property was never subject to disclosure, so this avenue is permanently closed." "Understood." After the call, she sat at the kitchen table for a moment longer. Then she put the trust deed and her father's letter back in the tin box and set it on the shelf above the sink, where she could see it, and she went out to the garden to finish the work she had left there. September came. The legal response moved through the court on the schedule Winifred had predicted. The response was thorough, the law was clear, and Garrison's attorney was exactly what Constance had suspected, an instrument of pressure rather than a serious legal challenge. The motion would fail. She knew it would fail. She was waiting. In the meantime, she came to the garden and refinished her cabinets and cooked with Roz and sat on her repaired porch in the September evenings when the Ohio air began its shift from summer to something more considered. Harold Sutton came on Tuesdays and Thursdays and stayed for dinner, and the community of Birchwood Lane extended and deepened in the way communities do when someone at their center keeps showing up. Beatrice's free vegetable section at the front of the garden, available to anyone who needed it on an honor system of take what you need and give what you can, brought people Constance had not met, strangers who became neighbors in the way strangers become neighbors when they are given a reason to speak. She learned names and remembered them, and learned the shape of the lives attached to the names, because that was what she had always done. And what she had always done turned out to be more useful in a small house on a residential street than it had ever been in the large house on Whitfield Drive, where the people she met were not neighbors, but social obligations wearing neighbors' clothing. Owen video called on a Thursday evening and caught her in the kitchen with Harold, the cabinets partially done, and both of them dusted with fine sanding residue. He laughed, the unguarded laugh, the one she had not heard from him in months, at the sight of his 69-year-old mother in work clothes, covered in sawdust, leaning over a cabinet door with a piece of sandpaper. She noticed that he looked lighter than he had in previous calls. She filed this without commenting on it. On a Saturday morning in late September, Roz did not come to the garden. This was unusual enough that Constance noticed within the first 20 minutes the way you notice the absence of something that has become part of the expected shape of a morning. She texted and received no reply. She waited another 30 minutes, watching the gate. Nothing. She told Beatrice she was stepping out and walked 3 blocks to the street where Roz lived, to the small yellow house with the window boxes that Roz's husband had built and that Roz maintained with the particular care of someone preserving evidence of something she was not ready to let recede. She knocked. A long pause. Then footsteps. Roz opened the door. She was wearing the clothes she had been wearing the day before, which meant she had not changed, and her eyes had the quality of eyes that have been crying for a long time and have moved past the acute stage into the dull aftermath of sustained grief. Behind her in the living room, Constance could see a cardboard box open on the coffee table and photographs spread around it, the disorder of a person who had gotten out objects they were not ready for and found themselves unable to put them back. "I don't see the point," Roz said. Her voice was flat. "Of any of it. The garden, the cooking, getting up in the morning. I know that's not what you want to hear. I know I'm supposed to be—" She stopped. "I just don't see it today." Constance looked at her for a moment. "May I come in?" she said. Roz stepped aside. Constance went in and sat on the sofa beside the open cardboard box and the scattered photographs. She did not say that it would get easier because she did not know precisely when that would be true and was not willing to offer an approximation when Roz needed something more honest. She did not say that Roz's husband would want her to keep going because telling a grieving person what their lost person would want was a way of using the dead to pressure the living. She sat down. She reached over and picked up one of the photographs. A man and a woman at what appeared to be a state park, both of them younger, both squinting into the sun with the happy squint of people who are not thinking about how they look. "Tell me about him," Constance said. Roz looked at her. Something in the flatness shifted. "His name was Franklin," Roz said. "Tell me about Franklin." Roz talked for a long time the way people talk when they have been carrying a story they have not been given sufficient space to tell, the way a full account of a person comes out when someone asks for it directly and then simply listens. Franklin had been a high school history teacher for 31 years. He had grown tomatoes in the backyard with competitive devotion. He had made terrible puns and been completely aware they were terrible and continued making them anyway. He had loved Roz with the consistency of a man who had decided in his 20s what the most important thing in his life was and had never revised that assessment. Constance listened. She held Roz's hand when Roz began to cry again, and she was quiet when Roz was quiet, and she stayed for 2 hours because 2 hours was what was needed. When she finally stood to leave, Roz looked at her with the exhausted and slightly clearer expression of someone who has passed through something and come out the other side not resolved, not recovered, but through. I don't know how you do it, Roz said, being this steady. I'm not steady, Constance said. I'm just here. Today let me be steady for both of us. That's all. She walked back to the garden. The September light was doing something particular to Birchwood Lane, and the surrounding streets, the low-angled light of a season shifting everything golden and slightly melancholy in the way of early autumn, which is the season that knows what is coming and does not pretend otherwise. She walked through it and she thought about Roz. And she thought about what it meant to be useful to another person, which was different from being needed by them and different from taking responsibility for them, and was something she had not fully understood until this year when she had been in sufficient need herself to recognize the texture of what actually helped. What helped was presence, not advice or solutions or the appropriate words delivered at appropriate moments. It was showing up in the room where someone was having a hard time and staying there without requiring the hard time to perform itself differently. She had spent 42 years being present in spaces that did not actually require her presence. She was only now learning to bring it somewhere it was genuinely needed. That evening, Winifred Cobb called. The court issued its ruling this afternoon, Winifred said. Garrison's motion has been dismissed. The trust has been found to fall entirely within the category of separate property under Ohio statute. The settlement stands. Constance was sitting on the front porch when the call came. The September evening was on the cool side of warm. The street trees on Birchwood Lane were beginning their turn, the edges of their leaves going gold and amber at the tips. She looked at the street, at the ordinary life of a residential neighborhood on a September evening, a couple walking a dog, a child on a bicycle with training wheels concentrating fiercely, Norma's porch light coming on at 24. Thank you, Winifred, she said. She put the phone in her pocket. She did not feel triumph or relief or the satisfaction of having been proven right. What she felt was quieter. The feeling of having done what needed doing and having it come out correctly, a feeling that required no amplification, no celebration, no one to tell. Her father had put his name on a trust document in 1979, and a court had affirmed that document in the autumn of 2024. And between those two dates, a man had loved his daughter with a thoroughness that expressed itself in legal instruments rather than declarations. She was sitting on the porch of the house he had protected for her in the evening light of a season she had not expected to find beautiful. And everything that needed to be true was true. She sat for a while in the quiet. Then she went inside to start dinner. October arrived the way October arrives in Ohio, without apology and without much warning, turning the air from the lingering warmth of September into something that had an edge to it, the kind of cold that did not yet commit to itself, but was practicing rehearsing for what it intended to become. The trees on Birchwood Lane completed their turn from green to gold to the particular deep red that Constance had grown up associating with the start of something, the season of beginnings that masqueraded as an ending. She was in the garden when the call came. A Tuesday morning, the sky a clear and saturated blue above the raised beds, the light coming in at the low angle of a season that understood its own limitations. She was harvesting the last of the season's tomatoes, with Beatrice working the row methodically, the way she had learned to work most things this summer. The tomatoes were late-season ones, smaller and more intensely flavored than those that had come in August, the ones that grew their sweetness from the compressed time they had to do it in. Her phone vibrated. She glanced at the screen without removing her gloves. Owen. A Tuesday morning call was outside the pattern. She pulled off her gloves and answered. Mom? His voice had a quality she had not heard in it for a long time. Not the careful quality of the Friday evening call 2 months ago when he had told her about Garrison's offer. This was different, lighter. The voice of someone carrying news that had been ready for a while and was finally allowed to leave. I need to tell you something. Tell me. I'm coming home. A brief pause. The firm is transferring me back to the Columbus office. Claire and I will be moving back in about 3 weeks. She stood in the garden row with the phone against her ear and the last of the season's tomatoes still on the vine beside her, and she did not say anything for a moment, because the thing that happened in her chest when she heard those words was large enough to require a moment before she could speak around it. Mom, are you? I'm here, she said. I'm here, Owen. She stopped, started again. When did this happen? The transfer came through last week, but Mom, he paused the pause of someone deciding how much of a longer story to tell. I need to tell you something else. I applied for the transfer in April. She was quiet, she said, the week after Dad filed. His voice was careful and direct in the way Owen's voice got when he was saying something he had thought about for a long time and decided to say completely. I called the Columbus office and I asked if there was a position, and there was, and I applied. Claire knew. We talked about it and she agreed it was what we wanted to do. Owen, I didn't tell you because I didn't want you to factor it in. Whatever you decided to do, I wanted you to decide it because it was right for you, not because you knew I was coming back. He paused. I wanted you to build whatever you were going to build, and then I was going to come home to it. Constance looked at the garden, at the raised beds, in the greenhouse, and the tool shed with Beatrice's hand-lettered signs. At Everett Grady's lavender border, the last of the season's blooms still holding. At the space that a woman in her 70s had organized a neighborhood into, making from a vacant lot, because she had understood that the difference between a community and a collection of people living near each other was nothing more than the decision to behave like a community. She thought about April. About herself in April sitting in the extended stay hotel on the north side of Columbus, holding a key ring with an old brass key on it, not yet knowing where she was going, but knowing she was going somewhere. She had been making the decision to build something while her son, 6 time zones away, was making the decision to come back to whatever she built. They had been moving toward each other in the same direction without knowing it. Since April. You should have told me, she said, and then before he could respond, but I'm glad you didn't. She heard him exhale the exhale of someone who has been holding something in and has been given permission to put it down. 3 weeks, she said. 3 weeks. Claire's been researching neighborhoods. The kids are, he laughed the unguarded laugh she had heard on the Thursday video call when he had caught her and Harold dusted with sanding residue. Emma wants to know if she can have a garden plot. I told her she had to ask you. Tell Emma yes, Constance said. Tell her I'll introduce her to Beatrice. After the call, she stood in the garden row for a moment longer. Beatrice, who had been working at a careful distance while the call happened, came back along the row with the unhurried approach of a woman who understood that sometimes a person needed a moment, and sometimes they needed company, and that the skill was knowing which. She looked at Constance. Good news. My son is coming home, Constance said. Beatrice set down her basket and put her arms around Constance briefly and firmly, the embrace of a 73-year-old woman who had learned that some moments required a physical expression. Happy tears, Beatrice said, pulling back, looking at Constance's face. The happiest. The 3 weeks moved with the quality of time that is both too fast and not fast enough, the quality of anticipation that makes ordinary days feel loaded with significance they would not otherwise carry. Constance cleaned the house with attention to detail that went well beyond what it required practically. She painted the bedroom that had been Owen's a warm cream that caught the morning light from the east window well. She set up the second bedroom for the children, buying a pair of twin beds from a thrift store on Broad Street, and betting that Emma and her brother had chosen in a video call from London, insisting on colors that did not coordinate with each other, but coordinated with what they wanted, which was Constance understood the correct criterion. She made space in the kitchen cabinets, the ones she and Harold had stripped and stained and finished over the course of the summer. She ran her hand along the wood each time she opened them, with the satisfaction of a person whose hands had made something that would outlast the making of it. She made space in the closets and cleared the bathroom of the accumulations. A person who has lived alone develops without noticing. She prepared, and as she prepared, she felt a specific anxiety that she examined honestly rather than dismissing it. The house was small, 1 bathroom, a kitchen that fit 4 people if they were comfortable with proximity. Owen had grown up in this house, but that was 30 years ago, and in the years since he had lived at various scales, including the scale of London, which was a city that did not prepare people for 1,200 square feet in suburban Columbus. When Owen called 2 days before the flight to say that Garrison had extended the offer of the Whitfield house again, the full house, the guest suite, the yard with the pool, no cost and definite arrangement, Constance felt the anxiety sharpen into something she recognized as the specific fear of a person who has put something of value on a table and does not yet know how it will be received. She told him the truth, the same truth she had told him in September, that her door was always open, that her house was always home, that she would not make this choice for him or tell him what the right answer was. She hung up. She sat in the kitchen for a while. Then she got up and finished making dinner and ate alone and went to bed and lay in the dark and let the fear be what it was, simply love organized around uncertainty, which is the only form love ever really takes when it is paying attention. She slept eventually. 2 days later, Owen's car pulled up in front of 22 Birchwood Lane at 5 in the afternoon. She had not planned to be standing on the porch. She had planned to be inside doing something practical so that she would not be visible on the porch looking like a woman who had been watching for a car because she was 69 years old and she had some dignity left. But she had heard the car on the street in the way that you hear the specific sound of something you have been waiting for, even when it comes at the exact moment you have stopped consciously listening, and she had been at the door before she understood she was moving. And then she had been on the porch in her apron with flour on her left forearm from the biscuits she had been making. A rental car, not Garrison's gray Mercedes. An ordinary rental car, the kind you got at the airport when you were starting over somewhere, the kind that said the contents mattered more than the container. Owen got out first, then Claire, who was dark-haired and capable, and had always understood in Constance's estimation exactly who her husband was, and had chosen him clearly rather than accidentally, which was the most anyone could ask of a daughter-in-law. Then Emma, who was 7 and had her father's eyes and her mother's certainty, and who stepped out of the car and looked at the house with the frank and undisguised assessment of a 7-year-old who had not yet learned to manage her expressions for social purposes. And then her brother Philip, who was 5 and had the serious concentration of a small person, taking in a great deal of new information at once. They stood on the sidewalk and looked at the house. Owen looked at the house and at Constance on the porch, and something moved through his face that she could not name precisely because it was made of too many things at once, recognition and relief, and something that might have been the emotion of returning to a place that has been real in the imagination for a long time and is now real in the actual. He came up the porch steps in 3 strides and put his arms around her and lifted her off her feet in the way he had done since he was old enough to be taller than her, and she pressed her face against his shoulder and smelled his specific smell, which was still underneath everything else, the smell of her son unchanged across decades and distance and everything that had happened in the intervening months. "You came here," she said into his shoulder. "Of course I came here." He set her down and held her at arm's length and looked at her face and then at the house behind her and then at her face again. "Dad's place is just a house. This is home." Emma was already on the porch looking at everything with the systematic interest of someone conducting an assessment. She looked at the repaired decking. She looked at the front door, which Constance had repainted in September, a deep green that she had chosen for reasons she could not entirely articulate beyond the fact that it felt right. She looked at Constance. "Grandma," she said, "do you have a garden?" "I have access to the best garden in 3 zip codes," Constance said, "and I know the woman who runs it. Come inside." That evening, Constance made dinner for 6 people in a kitchen designed for 2, which required a reorganization of the physical space that approached choreography. She had been cooking for groups all summer, had developed a sense for the way a small kitchen could accommodate the organized movement of people who were paying attention. But this was different from the community dinners in a way she felt rather than could have explained. This was the people she was made of, filling the space she had made for herself, and the combination of those 2 things was something she had not experienced before and was finding it difficult to look at directly because it was too bright to look at directly. Norma came with a cake at 7, appearing at the back door with the cake in both hands and the expression of a woman who had been waiting for this evening with almost as much anticipation as Constance. Roz arrived 20 minutes later with a salad. Roz, who had not cooked for anyone outside this house since Franklin died, had made the salad herself and brought it over, which Constance understood as a milestone without naming it as one in Roz's presence. Harold came at 7:30 with wine, 2 bottles, in the calm, unhurried manner of a man who understood exactly what kind of evening this was and what his role in it should be. Emma and Philip colored at the kitchen table, while the adults moved around them with the careful navigation of people who had accepted that the children were the center of gravity in this particular arrangement and were organizing themselves accordingly. The kitchen was loud. It was warm in the way small kitchens get warm when fully occupied, a warmth that had nowhere to go and became instead a kind of atmosphere, the warmth of a space being genuinely used by people who wanted to be in it. Dishes were passed, wine was poured, conversations overlapped without the careful social architecture of parties where everyone is performing their version of themselves for an audience. Owen sat beside Constance at some point in the evening when the dishes had been cleared and the children were in the living room with Roz, who had discovered a mutual interest in a series of illustrated books and had settled with them on the living room floor as naturally as if she had done it 100 times. Owen sat beside her and looked at the kitchen, at the cabinets she and Harold had refinished, at the yellow walls faded to the color of old butter at the window overlooking the backyard in its October colors, and he said, "I was so confused when you gave up the mansion." "I know," Constance said. "In the beginning, when you first told me what you'd done, I was worried about you. I thought maybe you'd made the decision in grief in the middle of something you weren't seeing clearly." He looked at his wineglass. "I was wrong." "You were watching from a distance," she said. "That's not the same as being wrong. You didn't give up everything." He said it like a man who has been thinking about the right words for something for months and has finally arrived at them. "I see that now. You gave up square footage and a prestigious address and a life that looked impressive from the outside. But you kept everything that actually mattered: your dignity, your peace, your ability to build something real." He looked toward the living room where Roz's voice was audible, reading something aloud. "Look at what you built, Mom. In 4 months, you built a community." "I moved into a neighborhood that was already a community," Constance said. "I just showed up consistently." "That's what building is," Owen said. She looked at her son and she thought about April, about both of them making their separate decisions in the same direction without knowing it, about the parallel lines of intention that had converged here at this kitchen table in this evening. She thought about her father in 1979 putting his name on a document that had held the door open for 45 years. She thought about the ways the people who loved you did their loving in different registers, some in declarations, some in trust deeds, some in the decision to request a transfer to Columbus in April so that they would be in position to come home to whatever their mother managed to make. "I'm proud of you too, you know," she said. He looked at her. "Me. You told me about your father's offer when you didn't have to. You let me make my own choice. Then you came here anyway." She looked at him directly. "That takes a kind of integrity that doesn't announce itself. I want you to know I see it." Owen said nothing. He looked at the kitchen table for a moment with the expression of a man receiving something he had not expected to receive and was not entirely sure what to do with. Then he picked up his wineglass and looked out the window at the October dark and the backyard, its leaves at their peak, and he said, "Wherever you are is home, Mom. I think I've known that my whole life. I just had to get old enough to understand it." 3 weeks later, on a Saturday evening and in the third week of October, the first official neighborhood potluck happened in the backyard of 22 Birchwood Lane. It was official only in the sense that Constance had sent invitations on cards she bought at the drugstore on Livingston and delivered by hand to everyone she knew within 4 blocks. In every other sense, it was an extension of things that had already been happening in various configurations throughout the summer and fall: the community dinners at her kitchen table, the garden work parties that always seemed to turn into meals, the informal gatherings on her front porch that started as conversations and became evenings. The backyard was a natural conclusion to all of that. Harold had helped her string lights between the fence posts and the branches of the largest trees. They had rented a fire pit and surrounded it with a collection of mismatched chairs that had accumulated over the summer through thrift stores and donations and the casual exchanges of a neighborhood where people left useful things on their curbs for their neighbors. Owen and Claire set up folding tables along the side of the yard. Dylan built a simple wooden platform beside the fence for people to put food on. By 6 o'clock, the yard was full. Beatrice, who had brought tomato sauce from her summer harvest, sealed in mason jars with handwritten labels. Roz, who had brought bread she had made herself, the bread representing something Constance understood as a milestone, without naming it as one in Roz's presence. Everett Grady, who came alone and spoke less than most people, and stayed longer than most people standing near the fire pit, watching the gathering with the attentiveness of someone who had learned to find value in the act of witnessing. Norma, directing the logistics of the food table, with the authority of a woman who had organized things for a long time and found it largely effortless. Harold at the grill showing Philip, who had decided that Harold was the most interesting adult at the party, how to manage the heat. Emma in the far corner of the yard, with two children from the adjacent street, having identified a low branch as a resource worth exploring. Molly Pierce with her twins. A dozen people from the garden and the street that Constance now knew by name and history and the particular texture of their lives. Constance moved through the yard. She refilled glasses and made introductions and facilitated the small collisions between people who did not yet know each other, the mechanism by which a gathering becomes a community event rather than simply a party. She had done this all her life in larger and more formal spaces with catered food and careful seating arrangements and the whole social engineering of a dinner party at the mansion scale. She had done it well, and it had always felt like work in the way that performance feels like work even when you are good at it. This did not feel like work. At some point in the evening, she stepped back. She stood near the fence with a glass of wine, and she looked at what was in her yard, and she let herself see it clearly without diminishing it or inflating it, just seeing it for what it was. Her small house with its 1,200 square feet and its thrift store furniture and its one bathroom and its repaired porch. Her modest yard with its mismatched chairs and its rented fire pit and its string lights. The people in it, none of them impressive in the ways Garrison had spent their marriage, valuing impressiveness. All of them present in the ways that presence actually meant something. Showing up, bringing food, talking to each other, being in a specific place at a specific time because they wanted to be there. This was what she had built. Not impressive, real. She was still standing there looking when Owen appeared beside her with Emma on his shoulders and Philip attached to his left hand, and he looked at what she was looking at and said, "You look happy, Mom." "I am," she said, genuinely and completely. "Good, you deserve it." She was about to respond when she became aware, without being able to immediately identify what had changed in her peripheral field, that someone was standing at the gate in the fence that opened from the side yard onto the driveway. She looked. Garrison. He was wearing the kind of clothes he wore on weekends when he was not making an effort to look professional, which was still better than most people managed at their most deliberate. He had not called ahead. He had not asked. He was simply there at the gate, the way he had simply appeared on Birchwood Lane that June afternoon, operating from the assumption that his presence required no prior negotiation. He was looking at the yard, not at her specifically, at all of it, at the fire pit and the string lights and the mismatched chairs and the tables of potluck food and the people moving through it, at Harold at the grill explaining something to Philip with the patient and specific attention of a man who takes small people seriously, at Roz talking to Beatrice with an animation that would not have been recognizable as the same Roz who had opened her door in September in yesterday's clothes with photographs spread around the coffee table, at Norma rearranging the dessert table with the authority of someone who had a strong opinion about the placement of cake. At all of it, Owen had gone still beside Constance. He had seen his father. "I'll go," Owen said quietly. He handed Philip to Claire, who had appeared at Constance's other side with the quiet efficiency of a woman who paid attention to rooms, and he walked across the yard to the gate. Constance watched them, father and son talking in the low voices of people being careful about what was audible in the space around them. She could not hear the words. She did not try. She watched Garrison's face instead, in the way she had learned to watch things from a careful distance. He was listening to Owen. He was looking at Owen and listening in the way people listen when they are receiving something rather than waiting for their turn to speak. And then his gaze moved, pulled by something, back to the yard, back to her. She held his gaze for a moment, not defiantly, not warmly. Simply the way two people look at each other when the story between them has arrived at its actual end and there is nothing left to prove in either direction. He looked for a while longer at the yard, at the fire and the people around it, at the children in the corner, at all of it, the unhurried looking of someone seeing something they had not expected to see and were taking the time to understand. Then he said something to Owen, brief, and he nodded once and he turned and walked back around the fence toward the driveway. He did not look back. Owen came back across the yard. He stood beside Constance, and they both looked at where Garrison had been. "What did he say?" she asked. Owen was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You look happy." A pause. He said he didn't know you could look like that. The party continued. Music started at some point. Someone with a guitar who knew three chords and the kind of enthusiasm that made three chords sufficient. Conversations deepened with the depth that evening, and firelight and the right people together produced the depth that has nothing to do with importance and everything to do with being present in the same place at the same time with your attention available. Constance stood near the fire at one point and felt its warmth on her face, and she thought this specifically. This is what she had meant when she said in that small courtroom in June that she would rather spend whatever time she had left building something she could not quantify. She had not known then what it would look like. She had only known the direction, the vague but certain sense of a compass needle that pointed towards something it could not yet name. This was the thing the compass had been pointing toward. In the morning, Garrison called. She was in the kitchen making coffee. Owen's family still asleep. They had been staying at 22 Birchwood for 2 weeks now, while their own house in a neighborhood to the north was being prepared, and the house had the early morning quiet of a space fully occupied in its sleeping portions and wide awake in its kitchen. His number appeared on the screen, and she looked at it for a moment, and then she answered. Constance, a pause. In that pause, she could hear the quality of a silence organizing itself around something difficult to say, and she waited because she had learned that waiting was more productive than filling. I saw you last night, he said, at the party. I know, I saw you. I was in the neighborhood. I thought. He stopped. The sound of him not finishing a sentence he had started was familiar in the way the habits of a 42-year marriage are familiar, even the habits you would not have chosen. You looked happy. I am. Another pause, longer. I made a mistake, Constance, with the way things ended, with Claudette and the. He stopped again. I've been thinking about what we had, what we built together. I think if we talked. Garrison, she said. He stopped. She looked around the kitchen. The cabinets she and Harold had stripped and stained through the August evenings, the wood warm and honest in the morning light. The kitchen table that had seated 6 people for weeks now without complaint. The window above the sink looking out at the backyard, the leaves at the peak of October color gold and amber, and the deep red that meant the season was fully itself. The refrigerator with the children's drawings held by magnets she had bought at the drugstore on Livingston Emma's name in careful 7-year-old letters on the corner of a drawing of a garden. She looked at all of it. I don't just prefer it, she said. I love it. I love this house. I love what I've made here. I love who I've become while I was making it. She paused. I want you to hear this clearly, because I mean it clearly. I am grateful to you. I know that sounds wrong, but if you hadn't filed those papers on my 69th birthday, I would never have found my way here. I would never have learned that I was capable of this. I would never have become this person. She paused again. So thank you, sincerely and completely. Thank you for setting me free. A silence. She waited to see if he would fill it. He didn't. Goodbye, Garrison, she said. Take care of yourself. She ended the call and set the phone on the counter. Her hands were steady. She looked at them, verifying this, and they were steady, the hands of a woman who had just done something irrevocable and was entirely at peace with the irrevocability of it. She poured her coffee and stood at the kitchen window and looked at the backyard in the October morning light. The leaves were translucent at their edges, where the sun came through gold from the front and more gold from the back, the light going all the way through them. She had planted that tree 33 years ago as a sapling on a Saturday afternoon while Owen napped. She had tended it for 7 years and then left it, and it had continued without her observation, growing in the unobserved way trees grow when no one is watching, which is the same way they grow when someone is. She was back now, and it was large and settled and entirely itself. She had returned. That evening, Harold came for dinner, just the two of them. Owen had taken his family to look at a neighborhood being considered for their permanent house, and Roz was at her book club, and Norma had a thing with her sister on Thursdays. The house was quiet in the way of a house usually full and temporarily empty, a different quality of quiet from the quiet of a house always empty. Constance had started a sauce in the afternoon, the slow-cooked kind that needed time and low heat and occasional attention. Harold texted to say he was bringing bread from a bakery he liked on High Street. He arrived at 6. He set the bread on the counter and looked at her and then at the sauce and then at her again and said, "Smells good." "It needs 20 more minutes," she said. "Then I'll help with something else." He moved to the cutting board where she had vegetables waiting. He picked up the knife and began, and they moved around each other in the kitchen in the way they had developed over the course of the summer, the way of two people who have been in the same small space enough times to have negotiated without words the choreography of it. He moved left when she moved right. He reached past her for the salt without asking, and she did not need to ask where he had put it because she already knew. They cooked. They talked in the easy way of people whose conversation had long since moved past the stage of requiring topics who could talk about anything or nothing with equivalent comfort. He told her about a cabinet he was building for a client in Bexley, a detail he was proud of. She told him about Emma's first garden plot, which Beatrice had officially assigned that afternoon a corner of the children's section with good sun exposure. The sauce was ready. She turned from the stove to reach for a bowl, and Harold was at the cutting board, and he said without turning, without preamble, without the kind of setup the moment might theoretically have warranted, "I love you." She stopped. He turned from the cutting board and looked at her directly in the way that Harold Sutton looked at everything he considered worth looking at. "I'm 68 years old," he said. "I don't have time to wait for a better moment or a more appropriate setup. I love you. I don't need you to say anything. I just wanted you to know." She set down the spoon she had been holding. She looked at him, at the flour on his sleeve from the bread he had picked up. At his hands, the hands of a man who had spent his life making things from materials that did not yield without effort, hands that had been patient enough to teach her how to feel when wood was ready for the next stage. At his face, which was the face of a man who had lived long enough to know what mattered and had arrived at this kitchen at 6 o'clock on a Thursday evening with bread from a bakery on High Street and the decision to say a thing that needed to be said. "I love you too," she said. "I didn't know I would. I didn't think I would when this summer started. But I do." He crossed the kitchen and he kissed her, and it was not the kind of kiss the movies made of such moments, not the urgent declaration of young love that had somewhere to be afterward. It was the kind of kiss two people exchange when they have both lived enough to know that the measure of a thing is not its intensity, but its honesty, when they are past the age of performing emotion for an audience and have arrived at the simpler and more difficult practice of simply having it. When they sat down to dinner, the sauce was at the right temperature and the bread was still warm, and the kitchen held the accumulated warmth of an evening of cooking and the light that made everything inside it feel considered and deliberate. They ate. They talked. The October dark settled over Birchwood Lane with the unhurried intention of a season that knew what it was doing, the temperature dropping by increments toward the first cold night of fall. After dinner, they went to the porch, the repaired porch solid now under their feet, the new decking pale in the porch light. They sat in the two chairs, the ones with the worn armrests, and Harold took her hand in his, and they looked at Birchwood Lane in the October night. The neighborhood settled into itself around them. A dog barking in the middle distance, then going quiet. The sound of a television through a window down the block. A car moving slowly along the street and then gone. The front yard trees, their leaves catching the streetlight at the end of their day, holding the light the way leaves hold light in their final days briefly and beautifully, and with the full knowledge that it would not last. "No regrets," Harold said. She thought about the courtroom in June, about the old brass key on a ring she had carried for 31 years, about the tin box under the kitchen sink and her father's handwriting on a letter dated March of 1993 and a trust document dated 3 years before that, about Dylan teaching her how to use a pry bar, about Roz's face in the doorway on the September morning, about Owen lifting her off the ground on the porch 2 weeks ago, about the potluck in the yard and the string lights and the fire pit, and Garrison at the gate looking in at something he had not known was possible, about Harold in the kitchen 20 minutes ago, flour on his sleeve, saying what he meant without waiting for the right moment. "Not a single one," she said. The October night moved around them unhurried, the night of a season that had arrived at its full expression and was not yet thinking about what came after. Somewhere on the block, someone had a window open, and through it came the faint sound of music, something from the old records, a melody that moved forward the way all good melodies move forward. One note finding the next by a logic that felt inevitable only after you had heard it. Constance Aldridge sat on the porch of 22 Birchwood Lane with her hand in Harold Sutton's hand, and she listened to the neighborhood settle into sleep around her, the Bays Inn, the televisions, and the cars going by on their various errands, all the ordinary evidence of all the ordinary lives being lived in proximity to hers. And she thought about the 69 years it had taken her to arrive at this porch on this October night. She thought that 69 years was exactly the right amount of time, that every year of it had been necessary, that even the years she had spent in the wrong life had been necessary because they had made legible, by contrast, what the right life looked like when she finally found it. Her father had put his name on a document in 1979. Her son had filed a transfer request in April, and she had walked out of a courthouse in June with an old brass key in her purse and the absolute and not yet fully formed conviction that she was going somewhere. She had arrived. The street was quiet. The lights in the neighboring houses were going off one by one as the evening deepened toward proper night. The trees on Birchwood Lane moved slightly in the October wind, their leaves releasing, a few of them spiraling down to land on the new decking, with the patient and unhurried finality of things that had held on as long as they needed to and were now ready to let go. She watched them fall. She was not afraid of what was coming. She was not afraid of the winter the October wind was practicing for, or of the ways the next year would differ from this one, or of the ordinary uncertainties that a life carried forward into, regardless of how well prepared or well loved the person living it was. She was not afraid because she had learned in the 4 months since she had turned a key in a lock for the first time in 31 years that the thing she had always been most afraid of starting over, being without the structure she had arranged her life inside, was not the catastrophe she had imagined it to be. It was a door. She had walked through it. On the other side was Birchwood Lane and a repaired porch and cabinets she had stripped and finished with her own hands in a garden 3 blocks north, and Norma at 24, and Roz and Beatrice and Everett Grady's lavender border, and Owen's family asleep in the rooms upstairs, and Harold beside her in the chair with the cracked armrest in the October night, in the music from someone's open window. On the other side was everything that actually mattered. She had been 69 years old when she found the door. She thought it is never too late. It is never too late to find out what you are made of. It is never too late to become finally and completely the person you were always going to be if you could just find your way back to where you started. The wind moved, the leaves fell gold and amber, and the deep particular red of the Ohio October falling in the ordinary and beautiful way of things that are ready. Constance held Harold's hand and watched them fall and did not feel anything as simple as happiness, which was too small a word for what was in her chest. She felt something that had no name. She knew of something that lived in the space between gratitude and recognition, the feeling of a person who has come home to a place they did not know they were looking for until they found it. The street was quiet. The night held everything gently.